This episode is supported by Code Comments, an original podcast from Red Hat. You know when you're working on a project and you leave behind a small note in the code, a code comment, to help others learn what isn't clear in the code? This podcast features technologists who've been through the tough tech transitions and share how their teams survived the journey. In each episode, Red Hat's Jamie Parker recounts the behind-the-scenes stories of experienced technologists from across the industry who share what they've learned from implementing new technologies. Episodes are available anywhere you listen to podcasts and at redhat.com/code comments podcast. Search for Code Comments in your favorite podcast player, and we'll also include a link in the show notes. Our thanks to Code Comments for their support.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is Aaron for Cloud News, but I am on the road this week. I'm actually not in the massive studios. And for Cloud News this week, actually, there's a whole bunch of cloud news in there. It is just absolutely amazing the amount of cloud news we have, but I'm not going to go over it this week because we actually have some giveaways. We've partnered with some folks for some events here recently and really excited to announce a couple of these. First of all Things Open. If you're not familiar with All Things Open, we've partnered with them in the past. Very large open source conference here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And we have 5 free passes to give away for the event. You do have to be there in person. So if you are considering attending All Things Open, it is coming up October 15th to the 17th. There is a link in the show notes for 5 free passes. If you want to go to the event, just click on there, discount code gets applied, and you get to go for free. If those are gone, there is another link in there for a 20% off discount code as well. Now, this event, like I said, partnered with them in the past, attended the event in the past, really, really highly recommended, and huge thanks to the folks over at All Things Open for their continued partnership. And we also have a second giveaway this week as well. Haven't partnered with these folks before, but looking forward to this. Packet Publishing Limited is putting on a virtual event all about AI. It's Put Generative AI to Work, and it goes from October 11th to the 13th. It is completely virtual conference. Normally, it would have a cost with it, but they were gracious enough to give us 3 passes to give away. Now, easiest way for this one is just go ahead and email us. If you are interested in this after you've listened to this, show@thecloudcast.net. Mention in there in the subject line, free pass for the Put Generative AI to Work conference. And the first 3 folks that listen to this and ask for that will certainly get you hooked up with a free pass to that. If those are all gone, there is also a 40% off discount that we're also going to include in there. So highly recommend you go check that out. If this is something that is of interest to you, definitely go ahead and get registered for that as well. So again, All Things Open, that one is in person in 2 weeks. Put Generative AI to Work is virtual, and it is next week. With that, I'm going to wrap up this, and we're going to, after the break, we're going to be talking with Mike Long, and we're going to be talking about the challenges of enabling governance and compliance into DevOps.
Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech. And we're back. And folks, as you know, one of the areas that we love to cover, and we love to cover it from a lot of different angles, is DevOps, and DevOps in all the many forms that it's sort of in today and how it's evolved. Kind of very good timing to be talking about DevOps, as DevOps Enterprise Summit is happening this week out in Las Vegas, and one of the areas that for all the things that people get excited about with DevOps in terms of number of deploys per day and working better with teams and better collaboration and blameless postmortems. One of the realities is no matter how much faster, how much more efficiency you're able to get out of your DevOps practice, out of the way that you organize, at some point, the business still has to adhere to certain governance principles. It has to adhere to certain security principles and things that, make sure that they, stay abreast of the law, stay, within the guidelines that they need for their industry. And so, finding that balance between, sort of the speed and efficiency of DevOps and, the requirements that the business has is sometimes a challenge. And we want to dive into that aspect of DevOps today and really kind of, get a better feel for what are best practices and what are some tips and tricks that people can learn in front of that going forward. So really excited today to have Mike Long, who is CEO at Kosli. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Yeah, you're actually out in Vegas this week at DevOps Enterprise Summit. Before we dive into that, give folks a little bit of your background, and then obviously, you started Kosli, you've been leading that company. Give us a little sense of where the company focuses, and maybe even what your focus is this week at DevOps Enterprise Summit.
Sure thing. So, I guess zooming out, the reason why I'm here is the same reason I've been involved in DevOps from the very beginning. Is that I'm just fascinated by how teams do their work. And, DevOps is a great place it's kind of like a community for folks that are kind of exploring all these ideas. Before I started Kosli, actually, I was a DevOps consultant. I was a CTO at a DevOps consultancy business. And it was great because, I got to go and look at the real challenges that real organizations in the enterprise have when it comes to delivering DevOps. And, everyone thinks they have quite unique challenges, and some do, in fairness, but you'd go to automotive companies and they would say, "Oh, we need to meet the ISO 26262 standard," or you'd go to a financial services company and they say, "The auditors wouldn't like that. We need to have our change advisory board." And you'd go to places that were working in healthcare, it'd be the same story over and over again. Right. We couldn't because of constraints, and generally, if you zoomed out, the constraints were the same everywhere. Right, you needed to have a process, like some way that described how you did your work, that managed your risks. You needed to actually follow that process, and actually DevOps is great for that because it kind of puts everything on rails. And then the third part is you needed the proof that you followed your process. So, like, you needed to, like, some places would talk about audit trails, others would talk about the change release notes, other folks would talk about at the end, it was a story of receipts.
Yeah.
So sometimes, when I introduce governance to like the general audience, I talk about going to buy coffee, right? If you go into Starbucks, you order your pumpkin spice latte. A few minutes later, after you've tapped your card, you're walking out there with your coffee. Everyone's happy. You've got your coffee. They've got their money. That's the end of a happy story, right? But say you're on a business trip like I am now, and you go down into the lobby, go to Starbucks, and you order your pumpkin spice latte. Everything's the same, except this time I'll ask for a receipt. And, I'll maybe take a picture of it. It'll go into some system of accounting, it'll maybe form a ledger, it'll have tax and legal implications, and it might be audited sometime in the future. It's the same thing. Like in both cases, I want a coffee, but the story around what you need to keep track of is completely different. And not every time you go for a coffee, you need a receipt. Not all kinds of software delivery or software development need receipts. But if you're working in banking, financial services, healthcare, automotive, safety critical systems, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, well, actually, there's a lot of places where you actually need the receipts. And that's kind of what I'm interested in. It's all about how we make that less painful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting because it's when you talk to folks who, obviously if you're just talking to developers, they're always focused on, how do I build what's new? How do I, get through as much as I can do? and you talk to folks who are responsible for auditing and governance and compliance and so forth, and it does sort of feel like you're walking around on eggshells with them. But like you said, oftentimes when you break it down, it becomes, tell us what you said you were going to do, show us how you do that, and then show us how you can validate what you said you were going to do, which in long form is exactly what you said. Show us the receipts for what you did and prove that you did what you said. I'm curious, as you've evolved in both your career, but also, what you're doing today, where do you find the biggest bottlenecks today in terms of, businesses come up with ideas all the time. Sometimes the expectation of those business ideas nowadays is, well, I need a digital experience. I'm going to need some sort of application or software to be written. And yet, we still sort of have this fear of governance or this, concern. Like, what do you think drives either that ongoing concern or just the bottlenecks in order to sort of match the speed that business wants to move and the speed that, companies are able to deliver it, in compliant fashion?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's actually we're kind of relearning the same lessons we learned with the formation of the DevOps movement, in the sense that, if we wind back the clock 10, 15 years ago, there was dev and there was ops. And, they would speak different languages. They would be rewarded by different incentives, and they have different values, essentially. One would be focused on keeping the system stable and up. Others would be changing the systems as fast as they could. And, the whole point of DevOps was to get those two tribes together, to stop being in different silos, different parts of the organization, and actually collaborate on what was a shared value stream. And we see the same thing with governance. So in companies, you'll have people typically outside of the engineering loop that are coming up with requirements, doing first line audits, setting standards, managing change processes and risk. You call them like the governance folks, and they, they're making up rules about technology they don't really understand or work with. And the same is true on the other direction, whereas engineers are providing evidence to the governance functions that is really hard for them to understand.
Yeah.
So we have this silo problem again, and it's about the language, but again, it's all part of the same value stream. It's kind of like we need this balanced scorecard. You need both the governance and you need the engineering, and the only way to really do it well is to break down the silos and work together. I think that's the thing that I find over and over again is the same problem, whether it's security. You go to a company and they talk about their DevSecOps transformation, and I as a bit of a granddad, I was just like, why do we have to have another word for DevSecOps or DevBizOps? And I was at a DevOps Days in Zurich, I think, last year, and somebody gave a great lightning talk and said, well, look, it's all DevOps in the end, right? But what they do by using that label is give you a clue what their fundamental challenge is. Yeah. So if they say DevSecOps, it means they want to do DevOps, but security is a real challenge for them. They're like, okay, wait, this is actually quite useful and interesting. So maybe all of these different permutations of DevOps actually do shine some light on what's going on in a company.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, because you're right. It does sort of highlight the thing that people are most struggling with. It's almost, I don't want to call it a cry for help, but it's almost like, it's like if a teacher were to give you the answers to the test ahead of time. They're sort of like telling you, look, this is what you should study. This is the important stuff. I'm curious, you mentioned that, you feel like to a certain extent we're kind of reinventing or relearning some things that, maybe, previous generation or even, 8 or 10 years ago, people were figuring out. How do you sort of explain to software teams, to development teams, sort of how to interact with those, say, auditing teams or those compliance teams, right? Because I think sometimes there's this fear of like, well, if we're outside of compliance, maybe somebody goes to jail. Maybe we have this, enormous fine that, is crippling to the business or whatever. But at the same time, I suspect there's a thing in their mind that sort of says, well, I mean, do you have to be compliant for like a moment in time, or do you have to sort of like constantly be compliant, or so for anybody who maybe doesn't have to necessarily deal with this, but might end up in a role that, compliance is a part of what they do. Like, give us a sense of how should they be thinking about this, that other team, or the language they should be using to interact with them.
Well, I think, like I said, I think we have a lot of the tools knowledge for how to solve this problem before, because we've done it in software when it used to be that QA was a separate department. Yeah. And you would do a bunch of development and you'd give it to them to find out if it worked or not. And we realized that, okay, that's not a productive way of making software. What we need to do is to make all the manual stuff that used to be in a big folder of release criteria and automate it. Well, you don't get rid of the testers. You put them in the team and they're doing exploratory testings. They're really validating the product in real time with the development process.
Yep.
And we did the same with ops, right? Ops, the DevOps movement is kind of the same learning. It's like, okay, instead of having them over there as part of the please maybe make a final change to the world, it's like, let's bring them in and figure out how we can make these changes safely on a more repeatable business. So in the same way, if you want to talk to your governance folks, you need to bring them closer to the work. Like, they have to really be very close. Now, in some cases, they can't be organizationally part of the team because of legal requirements, for example. In banking, you have like the 3 lines of defense concepts and so on, where it's kind of the whole point is that these parts of the organization are supposed to test against the controls that are in place.
Right.
But it doesn't mean you can't talk to them and really collaborate, because what's kind of interesting is because you have the siloed structures, things tend not to get improved. So what I find is like the most productive way to kind of get the ball rolling is to talk about continuous improvement on your risk policy. So it could be, we want to improve how we are mitigating against insider threats, or we want to get better at doing audit. We want to reduce the cost of audit. We want to have more successful outcomes, or talk about the outcomes you would like to achieve together with the risk folks. And then you can start to have a conversation. Well, actually, maybe instead of filling out a form, it's better to gather this information automatically, because it's going to be more correct, and you're going to make sure that you have consistency in the data you're collecting. Things like this. And step by step, you can build trust and have the conversation, because the biggest challenge that you face in the regulation process is that nothing changes. You come up with a process in 2004, and guess what? Today we still have a CAB meeting every release.
Right.
And it's just to have the conversation, but that requires a little bit of kind of transformational leadership as well. Folks higher up in the food chain that actually want to see these things improve.
Right. Well, and I think you highlight something that's really important. Really, kind of 2 things. One is, it sounds like a lot of things where you're dealing with different groups that may not necessarily be familiar with the other one, and they're describing things back and forth to each other, and you're kind of looking at them. You're trying to understand, like what are they talking about? And oftentimes when you use that old Stephen Covey principle of begin with the end in mind, where you sort of tell them, well, like this is what good will look like. Let's figure out how we get to that. And like you said, you may find that, somebody says, well, this requires a form, and you go, well, does it have to be that, right? Could it be something else? Or, okay, will this thing that we already have in place, will that do? Yeah, I think that's really important. I think the other thing you highlighted, was just this idea that it's not a one-time thing, right? It's like you said, the goal for both of you is to be in compliance. Obviously, the compliance officer has to be somewhat arm's length from things because they have a responsibility. But yeah, this isn't sort of a game of this isn't sort of a zero-sum game. This is really sort of a let's keep the bank in compliance. Let's keep the insurance company in compliance. And understanding that is important. So I'm curious. So software development kind of boils down to all these sort of impedance mismatches, right? Everybody kind of wants things to go faster, and maybe testing seems like it slows things down, or security seems like it slows things down. How does the work that you do with Kosli, how does that help reduce some of these things, or just kind of find maybe a better balance between sort of expectations and the ability to deliver?
Well, I mean, kind of going back to how they begin with the end in mind, that's kind of our whole philosophy in Kosli, is that we want to record the receipts, the facts about your systems without necessarily making any kind of judgments. You could call it forensics or whatever, but one of the, like, if you think of like the common controls that you see in these heavily regulated industries, like the most common one is change management, right? Where you have to have a bunch of paperwork, a big discussion, lots of fanfare about making a change. And, that's fine if you make a change once every 6 months, but it doesn't work if you want to make hundreds of changes a day. It just doesn't work at that kind of speed. And then it's like, well, okay, what do we want to do? Do we want to actually get closer to speed, or are we happy with this? And the reason I started Kosli in the first place was I did a consulting gig with a bank in Australia, and they'd gone from 6-month releases to 6-week releases, and the results were fantastic. Much less emergency changes, much higher chance of a release being successful, and so on. And they would like to get to daily or even on-demand deployments. And if you looked at the path to there, the problem wasn't in the development or the technical side. It was that it took 3 weeks to get a release out the door. Cut a branch, fill out the forms in SharePoint, create a change request in ServiceNow, have the CAB meeting, put a change in the change calendar, do it in the change window with a whole team around it. That whole story was like the limiting factor on them improving. And if you looked at that, each of those steps in there were supposed to be to either meet a regulation or to address a risk. But, as you started to peel apart it, like, you look at the APRA guidance, this is the regulator in Australia, and they don't say you need to have a CAB meeting, but that was kind of how they'd always managed the change.
Yeah.
So there's lots of other ways you can manage the change. What about if you just recorded all the commits that are going out automatically? What if you recorded the test results automatically? What if you made the approval process a pull request with the right people making the decisions? What if you had an automated deployment? If the risks were low for a change, why not let the change happen without a meeting? And start to realize, well, hold on, if we could just start to gather this evidence and keep track of things, then maybe this whole change process can go. And that was the start of what became Kosli. It's like, let's do this. Along the way, we also realized that you actually needed to record what was running in production. Like, you had to monitor what was running, because the only way to be in compliance on a continuous basis is, what's in prod, where did it come from, does it meet your expectations? So without actually tracking what's in prod, deployments can come around the side, you can have breaches. Swedbank had a fantastic issue with the regulator earlier this year, where they got fined $85 million. And they were investigated because there was a problem with their mobile banking app, I believe, and it showed the wrong balances, and it caused users to behave in ways than they would normally behave. So it was quite a big deal, even if it didn't change any of the underlying ledger. Everything was still good from a data integrity perspective, but it was still an issue for the customers. So the regulator in Sweden fined them $85 million, and it wasn't because they'd made the mistake, although that really was part of it, but it was also because they didn't have sufficient risk controls in place to deal with unauthorized changes. You think, okay, that's interesting, because who does? I mean, who can honestly tell what was running at any point in time and whether it should have been running or not? That's a really hard problem to solve. And that's kind of where we realized that you can't just focus on the delivery process. You also need to close the loop with what's running in production. And if you have a complete forensic history of what's running and where it came from, then you go a long, long way to solving for your audit problems.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the phrase flight recorder. That's sort of what people are looking for. What you guys do to a certain extent is sort of analogous to that. To not just did the plane land, did the plane take off, but what happened in between. Is that something that is becomes the foundation for the entire development team, or is that sort of primarily used by the auditing team, or do you find it starts in one place and then as the team becomes more proficient, it's like other things in DevOps, they just they merge together and you don't have these sort of separations of functions and concerns?
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely what we see. Is quite often will be implemented as part of a platform engineering story, or a move to a cloud, or a new developer experience being put into place. So we'll come along as it's typically SREs or DevOps engineers who are implementing the tool. But then we're actually sitting on really quite useful information, like when this deployment happened, what was the code difference between this and what was running before? Not just the git commit that was deployed, but what did it replace? And we have Slack integrations. A lot of highly regulated places, it's really hard for a developer to even know where their commits are. Did this is my feature in production yet? I don't have access to the cloud console. Maybe there's a lot of questions around just sharing the knowledge that we have the answers to. So especially when it's kind of funny as well, like that you have typical organizations have gone to like a more of a microservices architecture, which has a lot of benefits. Like loosely coupled architecture really does help you deliver software. But it does introduce new challenges, right? When you have 100 microservices, what changed suddenly becomes really important when you have an incident, because across 100 pipelines that may or may not have functionally deployed, it's really hard to know even what the difference between production is this morning than from yesterday.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You guys use a term or a concept called DevOps Automated Governance. What is that? What does it mean? And I guess most importantly, like what do companies get in terms of benefit from that? Because it's like we mentioned before, it sort of combines all the words that we want to have, but give me a sense of what that means in your world.
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a $5 phrase. I don't know if honestly, I don't know if it helps or if it hinders the term, because yeah, you're right. All those three words are all good things that we'd like to have. We'd like governance, but we'd like it in our DevOps and we'd like it to be automated. Great. Okay, but what does that mean in practice? Well, it goes back to like the big picture again. Like you need to have a process that controls for your risk. So you could, for example, say one of the risks we have in our hypothetical bank is that we have insider threats. Someone inside the business is malicious or deploys code that we don't want. And the risk we have in place, the control we have in place to manage that risk is code reviews, as an example. Okay, so that's fine. You've got that written down in your software development lifecycle somewhere on your wiki pages. Now the challenge is, how do you enforce that across everything that ever touches production? And this is where the concept of automation comes in, because what you can do is you can, in your pipelines, check for these things and record the fact that you made that check, gather the receipt, if you like, and store that and say, okay, now we have a control of which software has pull requests, and we can make decisions on whether we deploy or not, whether we create an alert, whatever we do off the back of that. We start to turn all of this policy, if you like. There's a lot of talk about policy as code, but I like to think more about policy as data, because what you want to do is to get the data to prove that you followed your policy. The decision's important, but really what's also important is the receipt.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. It makes total sense. I'm curious, and I'll sort of wrap up with this, because I know that you've got busy things going on at DevOps Enterprise Summit. You've obviously got a bunch of background in this, both from your consulting days, but also having turned a lot of that experience into the product of Kosli. And we always love to talk to folks who build things that sort of came directly from their knowledge. Do you find that there's any sort of good, kind of crawl, walk, run methodology or steps that you find companies have as they're moving into environments in which governance is important, or you're just having teams that are kind of being built in which they now have to interact with those compliance and governance people? Is there sort of a common first step, common sort of next phase, common third phase, or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the very foundation is going back to the people and starting with having a conversation. Because, okay, say you would like to do some kind of automation around your compliance efforts. None of that can happen unless you all agree to some policy. You need to be able to write this down. And it can start even just a corner. So like typically a good opportunity to start this new conversation is like, okay, we're starting with a new developer platform, or we're moving to the cloud, or we'd like to use Kubernetes, or something like this. You say, given this new change, how would we like to do change management in this process? Because our business goals to go to Kubernetes, say, is that we'd like to have more frequency in our deploys, more resiliency, and a move to containerization, which will give us more immutability and better auditability of our technology. So, you have to start selling these concepts in to the right people, because in the end, if you can't change the policy to say, we don't need a cab because we're solving it in this way on this system, then you're not really going to get very far. But say that's the kind of the very beginning. Can we show that we can control risk and give you better insight into governance by making this change? And then from there, you can start to move towards the technical realm, I would say.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I think, if we were to boil down kind of all the things we talk about here on the podcast, it does boil down to that, the business wants to do something new. It's probably going to involve technology change at a different pace than you're used to, or with a different path than you're used to. And oftentimes the success or failure of those things boil down to, can you adapt to those change and wrap sort of new skills and new process around that type of change. So no, that's a great point in terms of this stuff isn't, and I think you've been reiterating this throughout the conversation, is this stuff isn't some, crazy voodoo magic. It's really just applying, DevOps principles with this idea that, you need to have the receipts, you need to have data, you need to do change management well. And you don't have to necessarily do things exactly the way you did before. But a lot of your muscles that you used before are probably reusable if you can adapt them in certain ways.
Yeah, I think also as a tool vendor, I'm one of the weird ones that always says that actually tools are usually the last part of the solution.
Yeah,
it's the people that you need to start with in the organization. But on the other hand, like adopting a new tool, having a strategic new technology in your stack can help be the lever that opens up those conversations as well.
Right. Yeah, that's the other thing we've seen quite a bit is as much as we followed the DevOps movement and bid to events and everybody talks about it. You're right. Sometimes, just having something that's a better lever, a better hammer, while it's probably not going to be the end all be all, oftentimes is a really good starting point. Before I let you go, what is oftentimes if folks are looking for, ways to put, sort of wrap better governance around their DevOps, what are the best ways to engage with the Kosli team, get started with the tool, get started with the technology?
Yeah, Kosli is we have a free tier to get started. You can try it out. We have a Slack community, great documentation, and, we're always happy to have a conversation and learn more about your needs. So we've been doing this for a while now and helped a lot of companies. So if you do want to get in touch, we've got lots of ways for you to do that on our website. Outstanding. Mike, thank you very much for the time. I know you're going to get back to the conference and it's getting started, but thank you so much for the time, folks. As we mentioned before, this space is one that, is constantly evolving. We build off of the sort of learnings from the previous
5 years, 6 years, 7 years, but DevOps is a space that continues to evolve. So hopefully this was helpful to you. I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community. And thank you again to Mike for his time today. So folks, with that, we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.